Welcome to Intangibles, a podcast about the traits, behaviors, and qualities that entrepreneurs can cultivate to help be successful. This podcast is created by Antecedent Ventures, an enterprise-focused seed-stage venture firm in New York City. You can find us at www.antecedent.vc. I'm your host, Steve Berg. This season is brought to you by Denton's Venture Technology Group at dentonsventurebeyond.com. Operating as a boutique within the world's largest law firm, the Venture Technology Group runs with hard-charging tech entrepreneurs to drive growth through strategic business, finance, and legal advice, from Silicon Valley and New York to London, Berlin, Hong Kong, and beyond. Learn more at dentonsventurebeyond.com. Today's topic is willpower. It's no secret that when an entrepreneur starts a company, there are going to be a lot of natural forces that conspire to stop that company from being successful. Sometimes the founder's stubbornness and might are the only things that keep a company going. As a venture capitalist, I want to make sure that the founders I back have the willpower it may take to drive the company forward. As we will cover today, willpower is among the more important qualities a founder can have. And as I have come to learn, there are ways a person can actually improve her or his willpower. My guest today is John Tierney. John is a great person to discuss willpower with because he, along with psychologist Roy Baumeister, wrote a book called Willpower, Rediscovering the Greatest Human Strength. John has written a number of other books, and he's also a journalist who writes for the New York Times and the City Journal. Welcome, John. It's great to talk to you again.
Hi, Steve. It's nice to be here.
Why don't we start by having you fill in some of the blanks about your background that I've neglected?
You covered it. I've been a journalist for a long time now. I've written for the New York Times, for lots of other publications. I've written about New York City, and for the last 10 years or so, I've mostly been writing about science with a real focus on social psychology. And that's how I got involved with Roy Baumeister on willpower, because I saw things that I had noticed before writing about things. And Roy's theories about self-control seemed to jibe with a lot of things I'd seen in the real world.
Well, that's a perfect segue. Let's dive into this. One of the things that makes the book Willpower so compelling to me is that it takes the intangible quality and it ties it back to a great deal of empirical research and also history. Can you give a hint of all the work that you've done to create this intersection of science and behavior?
Well, I got interested in this topic originally. I wrote a parody of self-help books called God is My Broker. It had a monk tycoon reveals the 7.5 laws of spiritual and financial growth. And to write that, it was about this monastery that gets rich and corrupt, and they discover how to get rich. And it was parodying self-help books. And to write that, I went back and I read all these self-help books starting back in the 19th century, or actually the 18th century with Ben Franklin. And I discovered the strange thing that the books seem to get worse with time, that the old ones really emphasize practical things about perseverance and self-control. The Victorian books really had these sayings like genius is patience, and then when you got to the modern ones, there was all this quick, believe it, achieve it, how to win friends and influence people. As long as you're friendly and you smile in the right way, you'll get ahead. And I was curious in doing this, what happened? There's backward evolution about why are things getting worse? And I didn't know what to make of this until writing the science column for the New York Times. I met Roy Baumeister, and he told me about his work with willpower. And he had gone through somewhat of a similar process. He, early in his career, he had started studying self-esteem, which is a big thing in the 70s. And there was this idea that if you had confidence in yourself, if you believed in yourself, that you would succeed. And they had noticed that there was this correlation between people who had high self-esteem and success. But Roy discovered that that they had the thing backward. That being successful would give you self-esteem, but having self-esteem did not make you successful. If it did, Donald Trump would be, he would be winning the Nobel Prize every year. So Roy then started looking into what does correlate with success, and he started studying self-control. And he found, he and other researchers kept discovering that the two basic qualities of success, that you find over and over again, things that correlate with success, are intelligence and self-control. And, we can't do much about intelligence, but Roy discovered that you can do things about self-control.
So I remember in reading it, you talked about a couple of experiments. There was the radish experiment, and I think also the chocolate chip cookie experiment, which piqued my interest, and were also kind of like how I was mentally tying back the empirical research to the actual quality.
Well, you got it. It was one experiment involving both those things, And Roy, what he did was he invited, the students in this experiment. He told them to skip lunch and come to his laboratory in the afternoon, so they're pretty hungry, and they would walk into the lab. And they would see sitting there, and a student would be alone in the waiting room, and on the table would be this dish of freshly baked chocolate chip cookies. You could smell it. They just heated it up in the lab, and it would be sitting there, and right next to it would be this bowl of radishes. And, some students were allowed to eat the chocolate chip cookies. They were the control group. But the real experiment was the other ones. They were told that they were in the radish condition. And as always, they lied to the guinea pigs. And they told them it was an experiment about how people taste things and what they do. So their job was not to eat the cookies, but to eat a radish, and they had to do that. And they would leave them sitting in this room, hungry, smelling these cookies for like 10 minutes. And then after 10 minutes, and while they did this, the experimenters would watch them through this hidden window. And these guys, these students are hungry and they're looking at the cookies, and some of them would go over and like pick up a cookie and smell it. But they did manage to avoid not eating it. They exercised their willpower. And then after that, they would go into another room and they would do these puzzles to give, and they thought that the puzzles were a test of how smart they were, but the puzzles were actually insoluble. You couldn't do it. And the real test was how long do they keep working on these puzzles until they give up. And what they found was that the people who had to resist the chocolate chip cookies for 10 minutes, they gave up like in half the time of the other people. And this was an amazingly large effect for a laboratory, to get it cut their time on the puzzles by half. And what this showed was that until then, really for most of the 20th century, scientists had thought that willpower was this kind of weird metaphor from the Victorians, that, there was this idea about character, but that it really was this source, the willpower was a real source of energy, and that you could deplete it. And that, they had successfully resisted eating those cookies for 10 minutes, but they used up all this willpower, and they didn't have much left when it came time to do another task that required self-control.
So if something can be depleted, the implication that it can be measured. Is willpower something that is it scalable? Can you measure willpower?
Yes, they have several ways to measure it. In these labs, what they would do is they would there were several different tests. One is to squeeze to hold one of these hand things that you squeeze together with your, and there's a spring on it and you have to do it. And basically how long you can do that is a test of your self-control, because it gets difficult and painful. And so how long you do that. And they would measure them before and after to see how much they had left. Another test they use in the lab is to put your hand in ice cold water, and how long do you keep it in there. And that takes self-control too. And Roy and some other researchers, they also developed a questionnaire. They would ask people, how often do you give in to temptation, and a whole battery of questions to see how often you did it. And they found actually that when they did the self-control assessment test, and they would compare that with other kind of personality traits that they measure, they found that it was the only trait that really predicted college grades, other than intelligence. And it actually predicted college grades better than intelligence, self-control. How much self-control you
better than IQ, better than SAT.
Yes.
Wow. Yeah. So I think what you're saying is willpower is kind of like a muscle. Right. Can a person can consciously choose to improve their willpower?
Right. It's like a muscle in that it gets fatigued with use. So as you run a mile, your muscle's weaker at the end of it, and during the day, your willpower gets depleted as you use it, to resist, telling your boss what you really think of them, and not eating that donut that is there. But you can also build up that muscle over the long term by doing exercises that build up the stamina. So it gets fatigued during the day, but over the long haul, you can build up its stamina the way a runner does by practicing.
And I think Roy was able to test that using a number of different things. And the interesting thing about each of those things is wherever they started at one point, it seemed like they all kind of converged on each. If you started, for example, you've often told the story about posture, improving your posture, right? But if you started at posture, or if you started at financial self-control, or you started at eat healthy, all of the, like, one just lent you to have stamina into
there
the
was
others.
this spillover effect. I mean, they really weren't sure what to do, how to do this. And they tried various things, and they did one experiment that they didn't really expect to work, which was they just told the students, they had different groups doing different things and different kind of exercises. And one group was told, just for the next 2 weeks, work on your posture. When you're, whether you're sitting down or standing up, just try to stand up straight, the way teachers used to tell kids. And they found when they came back to the lab 2 weeks later, they would give them a bunch of tests to do involving self-control that, and these tests had nothing to do with posture, but they did better on those tests. And then there was a series of experiments, as you mentioned, in Australia, where they had different groups. They had some students were given coaching to work on their finances, basically how to budget, how to save money. Another group was to work on their diet, to eat healthier, to do other things. And then another group was told to work on their study habits, and they worked on techniques for doing that. And what they found as the experiment went on was that, sure, the people who got better study habits, they did study better, but they also got better, at eating and their finances. That improving self-control, building up that muscle in one area, improved it overall. And there was this, as you say, spillover effect.
I think that's good for me because I can start small and slowly moving forward. So look, a big reason that I care about the preservations of willpower is that there's a bunch of scientific evidence that it's a predictor of positive outcomes in your life. Can you give a little more color on that? I think you were kind of hinting at it earlier, but I think there might.
Well, I mentioned the students, that it predicts college grades, but they have basically done this. That they found that essentially, however you define success, whether it's in your career, at school, in your personal relationships, when it comes to making money and saving money, when it comes to losing weight, when it comes to being healthy, that self-control is correlates with it. That it's just crucial to all these things. It's one of the few predictors you find. I mean, as we say in the book Willpower, however you define success, it basically tends to correlate with with intelligence and self-control. Those are the two things you find over and over again.
So I'm going to reference another test, and I'm on shaky ground when it comes to these experiments, but there's the marshmallow test at Stanford that
Yes.
I think is related to this. Am I right?
Right. They were. This was done an experiment that had kind of an unexpected result too, where they were studying these kids, and they wanted to see how people how kids delayed gratification, and so they did this experiment where they would put a marshmallow on the table in front of a kid and leave him, and I think the kids were 2, I think, or maybe slightly older. I can't recall, but. They would put them there, and they would tell them, if you don't eat that marshmallow by the time I come back, I'll give you another marshmallow. And then they would leave the room and let this poor kid sit there and look at the marshmallow. And they were interested in how do kids do that, and some kids would kind of stare at it and try and, use their self-control. And then some kids would sing to themselves. And the most effective strategy they found was really kind of distracting yourself, doing something else. Don't just sit there staring at the marshmallow saying, I'm not going to eat you. That experiment went as far as it did. And the kids came from the school that the faculty at Stanford sent their children to, and the experimenter, Walter Mischel, his kids went to the school, and he just happened to, over the years, like a decade later, he would hear about his kids' friends, and a lot of them have been in this experiment, and he would hear who was, getting into college and who was getting in trouble and who was doing this, and he just started thinking back to that marshmallow experiment. So he went back, he found all these kids, or as many as he could, and he looked at what happened to them, and it turned out that marshmallow test, the kids who were able to resist eating that marshmallow did so much better in school, they did better in college. They got and so it was again this predictor, and then and there have been much more since then. There have been these huge studies. There was a giant one in New Zealand where they tracked just thousands of kids, and they looked at their self-control as they were children. They had various measures of their assessments by their teachers, and then they tracked them through life for decades, and they found that the kids who had self-control as kids, they did better in school, they made more money, they saved more money, they were healthier, they were less likely to wind up in jail. That it just correlated with all these positive outcomes.
Better marriages, healthier, everything. Okay, so you hinted at your parody book, but you actually did in Willpower develop 8 laws that govern willpower, right?
Right.
So let's spend a moment on each of them. The first one is know your limits.
Right, and this is you have to recognize that willpower is this finite amount of energy that you have, and you can build up the muscle over time, but during the day it's going to get depleted. And what's difficult about willpower is that there isn't any single symptom you can look for that, my willpower is down. It's not like hitting the wall when you're running a marathon. You don't suddenly just feel this pain. What happens is that you basically start losing your ability to control your reactions to things. So somebody who irritates you ordinarily a little bit during the day, you suddenly snap at. You just get angry. It's harder to resist that tempting food. You just have a harder, and you react more strongly to things because you can't control your emotions as much anymore. So what you have to recognize is that there is this finite amount you have, and they've done experiments where they've had people wear beepers all day long, and it'll go off, and then it'll ask them, what are you doing at the moment? Are you resisting any desires at the moment? And people would say, yes, I'm resisting the desire to eat something or to go to sleep or to goof off at my desk. And they would track them, and they would compare this also with people's measures of self-control. And what they were really surprised to find was that the people who had really good self-control, who scored very high in this trait, actually used less willpower during the day than the other people. And it didn't really make sense at first, because you think these are these hardy people who can just power through everything. But what they found was what really gave them, this great self-control, was that they structured their lives to avoid temptations. And so therefore they conserved their willpower for the important stuff.
The other thing I think with regard to that, if I recall right, is make your tougher decisions in the morning. Right.
Well, there's a thing called decision fatigue, and this was another really interesting finding that they came up with. And what happened actually was one of Roy's researchers, there was a postdoctoral fellow, and they were working on these experiments with the willpower. It's called ego-depletion, when your willpower, you lose it. And she was planning her wedding at the time, and she'd been doing this bridal registry with her fiance the night before, and she just said they just felt exhausted after it. And all you're doing is sitting there saying, I want this kind of china, I want this kind of plate, I want this. And she wondered if this had the same effect. Was this depleting something in her? So they did these experiments where they had people basically do shopping and make other decisions. And they found the same effect, that basically when you make a decision, you're depleting your willpower the same way as when you resist that chocolate chip cookie. And so we're going to call this decision fatigue. And so basically your ability to make decisions goes down during the day. And after I wrote an article about this for the New York Times magazine, the editors, one of the editors said to me, we've decided no more meetings after 3:00. Basically, people, they're just tired. They made all these decisions. And there was an amazing study in Israel of these judges on a parole board. And the prisoners would come in and they would be asking for parole. And they found that first thing in the morning, they had a decent chance of getting parole. But then as the day went on, your odds of getting parole just went down and down and down, because giving someone parole is that's making a hard decision, because there's a risk if they go out and do something, you're in trouble. It's just easier to say, no, I'll leave them in prison. Let's duck that decision. And that's one of the things you do when you have decision fatigue. You just duck the decision. You postpone it. So they found that this really exists. And so, you make your big decisions in the morning. Don't make big ones later.
When you've got a reservoir, like a deep reservoir of self-control to do it. Okay. So the second one is practice willpower. And I guess that's repetitive acts of self-control.
Right. They found in these experiments that basically anything that you do that requires self-control will build up that muscle. And they did things like, tell somebody, do things you ordinarily do with your right hand, like brush your teeth, do it with your, opening doors, do it with your left hand. That just requires a conscious act. Or try to speak without using contractions, or try not to use obscenities, just anything that requires you to use self-control, that builds up that muscle. And in doing this, and they found that it actually did work. And this also explains another finding that psychologists have been reporting for like almost a century now, which is that religious people tend to have better self-control than non-religious people. And part of this is self-selection, that it takes a certain amount of self-control to go to church, every weekend. And so someone who doesn't have it is less likely to be it. But we think that it's also because religion, most religions have all these forms of acts. You have to say, you have to get on your knees, you have to pray, you have to fast, you have to say the rosary, you have to do all these, you have to memorize prayers. Kids grow up learning all these things they have to do to exercise self-control. So they're building that willpower muscle, basically. And then, and when you're older, then you're better able to cope with other kinds of temptations.
Well, I remember the first time we talked about it, and you mentioned something about brushing your teeth standing on one foot. And I have been doing that, and I will tell you that it is just about to drive me nuts. So I hope that my willpower.
But I can see that you have much better self-control than the
just
last
by looking
time.
at me.
I can tell you're really.
Okay, number 3. This is you need to eat and keep your glucose level high. And you touched on the Israeli prisoner.
Right.
I think that one fits in here too.
Exactly. That was another fascinating finding from that study. They found that in general the judges' self-control went down during the day, but they noticed there were a couple weird little peaks where suddenly they would go up again. And then they looked back at the judges' schedule and they realized that they would go out mid-morning for a snack. They would come back, and right after they came back, they'd gotten some sugar, they had a donut or they had some fruit or something. Then the prisoners' odds would go back up. They had replenished their self-control, and they had more decision-making ability, and the prisoners' odds went up. And they noticed the same pattern after lunch.
Yeah, so I think I'm just going to be not trying to squeeze one last one in before the lunch break.
But this is as I say, this is like finally there is scientific justification for the business lunch, right? The expense account lunch.
I think there's irony in that if your willpower is about going on a diet, then there's a catch-22 there, right? You need to eat to have the willpower to not eat.
Exactly. And that's why, when people think about willpower, the first thing they think about is dieting usually. We think you have great willpower, he can resist the donut. And it's definitely true that having self-control helps you with that. But of all the things they measure in self-control, all the things, maintaining your weight is kind of the weakest correlation of it all, because it is such, people think that that it's a great measure of how thin you are, how much self-control you have, but a lot of it is in fact beyond your control. It's partly your biology, it's your genetics, it's other things. And there is also the simple fact that when you starve yourself, you're basically depriving your body of glucose. And they did these experiments where they found with they would test people's self-control, and they would find that simply giving them a glass of lemonade would replenish that self-control. But the lemonade had to have sugar in it. If it had Splenda, it didn't work. And they even found this effect. They did this with dogs. They did an experiment testing dog self-control, where they would tell them to sit for 10 minutes, and then they would and see how long they could do that. And then after they did it, and then other dogs, like the control group, was put in a cage so they didn't have to use their self-control to stay for 10 minutes. But they would find once again that the dogs that had to exercise self-control, make themselves stay, they would then give up sooner on doggy versions of puzzles. They had their own. But they also found that they could replenish that by giving the dog some food containing sugar. So that's the terrible thing about, that if you starve yourself, then you're not getting glucose, and your brain doesn't have the fuel for the energy, so you don't have willpower.
All right, moving right along. Number 4 is avoid the planning fallacy.
Right. Most of us, almost all of us suffer from this. People typically when you ask someone how long will a project take, they'll usually estimate a time that's like half the real amount of time. And it's very tough to avoid the planning fallacy. One way is, the basic techniques for self-control, the overall techniques are, you should set a very clear goal, and then you should monitor your progress toward it. That's basically true for almost anything. And one advantage of monitoring your progress is that you can look back and see, well, when they asked me to do this report before, it took me a week and a half. So you won't say, oh, I'll get that to you on Friday. That's one way to do it. And just try to build in extra time for things, because we always think everything's going to go well, but it's very rare that everything goes well on a project. There's always something unexpected.
My wife asks me, she has no sense of things on a continuum. So she's always just like, oh yeah, I'll do that in 30 minutes. And you're like, no, it'll take you an hour. And she's actually gone to the point where she's like, yes, you're right. It'll take me an hour.
Well, that's it. You've hit on one of the other techniques for avoiding the planning fallacy, which is ask someone else, because we're much more realistic when you say, how long is it going to take him to do that? We're much more realistic about someone else than we are for ourselves. We just have this, I don't know what it is. I've been a journalist for a long time, and an editor will say, when can you get this piece in? And, I'll have it for you. This one won't take long. It'll be smooth. And I have to stop myself and say, no, if you think it's going to be a week, give yourself 2 weeks.
After all these years.
Yeah.
All right. Number 5, create to-do lists with specific and doable actions.
Right. This is the one self-help book that, in doing my parody of self-help books, the one book I really liked and is David Allen's Getting Things Done, which is, the acronym for that is GTD, and there are lots of, it's a cult practically, a well-deserved cult, because he really did hit on a great system for being efficient. And his, he discovered something called the Zeigarnik, well, he didn't discover it, but he used something called the Zeigarnik effect, which my co-author on Willpower, Roy Baumeister, did some work on that. And just to go back briefly to what it is, it was some students at the University of Berlin, some scholars there, went out to lunch one day, and the waiter took their orders. He didn't write anything down. And then he delivered everything perfectly. They leave after lunch. They were all impressed by the guy, and somebody forgot something, goes back and asks the waiter, for help in finding it. And the waiter looks at this person like he's never seen him before. And they can't understand. Don't you remember you brought me this? He goes, as soon as I deliver a dish, it vanishes from my memory. And so, and the psychiatrist Bluma Zeigarnik studied this more, and she found that the brain makes this big distinction between finished tasks and unfinished tasks, and that once you finish a task, then your brain stops processing it, and your unconscious stops nagging you about it. It really frees you up. And so, this is an important finding. And then Roy Baumeister, when he did some experiments testing people's willpower and how this affected them, how to use this as a Zeigarnik effect. And these were the students who had a big exam coming up. And thoughts of that exam would distract them. And he gave them these tests where they'd read a novel and then answer questions about it. And basically worrying about that exam would intrude on them, and they didn't do so well. But he found that a way you could counteract that was just to have some of the students would just make a plan for the exam. Like, I'm going to study Sunday afternoon in the library at 4:00. And that once you made that plan, then it freed your mind up and you weren't distracted, and you were able to focus on your task. And that's what David Allen did with his book, really. His whole point on to-do lists is you have to write it down there, and it has to be the very next action. It has to be something that you know how to do. It isn't like, just do my taxes, because nobody knows. You can't sit down and do your taxes. It's like, make it an easy task, like gather my receipts or call my accountant, or a very specific thing to do. And once you've done that, then it stops nagging at you.
All right. Number 6, you touched on this actually a little bit too. Track, measure, monitor your willpower progress.
Right. Which is that you just, monitoring something is just so important for knowing. It's good in several ways. One is that it just tells you how well you're doing, so you've got a measure of it. And I think knowing that you're going to, have that measurement, then it gives you an incentive to do it. One of the simple things I do is when I'm working on a book or an article, I set aside, time for this, and I make myself write down at the end of the day, how many words did you write? And it's a really simple measure, but and I think just knowing that that's going to be there makes me think, God, you better get something done today. You don't want to have to write down a really low number. And the other advantage of monitoring is that it especially on long projects, that it often feels like you're going nowhere with it. A book is it just drags on and on. It feels endless. But at least if you can look back over the last 3 weeks and say, well, I did get, X thousand words done, and here's where I was back then, and here's where I am now. It gives you some progress to feel better about. And as I said earlier, it also helps you think, well, it's taken me this long to do these words, so how much longer will the rest of the book take?
I remember you telling me the story about the author Graham Greene, and I've thought back on that one a couple of times about how many 15 minutes to write 200 words or something like that.
Well, Greene would do a thing. Yeah, he did. I can't remember. He had like a little quota where he would do how many words he did every day. Trollope was the ultimate. Anthony Trollope, who wrote the 18th century novelist. He did this thing where he would get in bed in the morning. He worked for the post office. He's the guy who invented the mailbox. Actually, he had a day job, but from 6 to 9 in the morning, he would write in bed, and he had a watch right next to him. And in every 15 minutes, he had to write. I think it was 250 words every 15 minutes. So he'd write 3,000 words a morning. I
remember you telling me this story and just how insane I found that number.
Well, every writer, writers do it, and it just seems, appalling to be able to write that much. And you read some of his novels, and you go, yeah, this could have been shorter.
All right, number 7, focus on one thing at a time and eliminate the unimportant things.
Right. This is from another writer, what I call the nothing alternative, and it's from Raymond Chandler. Who wrote these great detective novels, The Big Sleep, and he himself, he talked about there are some writers who can just sit down and make themselves, and I think he had Trollope in mind, who I can't understand these people who can just sit down and write thousands of words on command. So he said that what he does is, his strategy was that he only had 2 rules for writing. One is that he'd go in a room for a few hours and then follow 2 rules. The first rule was you don't have to write. Rule number 2 was you can't do anything else. And so that's what I try to do in the morning. I actually use a timer next to my keyboard, and I do an hour and a half on my main task, which is usually, the book I'm writing. And I can't do email, I can't answer the phone, I can't do anything else. So, and I think at least it focuses you somewhat, because otherwise there's a million things you can always do.
It sounds to me like what you're saying is that procrastination actually erodes willpower.
Right. Well, procrastination, it's a way to avoid, it's one way to deal with decision fatigue. People, that's, when you don't have any willpower and you face a tough decision, it's easier I'll do something else instead. I'll answer an email instead of actually making this decision here. And procrastination is a way just to avoid, there are people, and I've joked about the power of positive procrastination, that, and somebody wrote a funny paper about this that we talk about in the book, that he says, what you do is you set yourself one incredibly unpleasant task, like doing your taxes. And to avoid that task, you procrastinate you get other stuff done. So maybe you'll write your book because I don't want to do my taxes. But it's not a good way to do it because you're using all this energy, like the taxes are nagging on you,
Last one, conserve your willpower.
That's the thing where people who have great willpower are people who conserve it and they structure their lives to avoid temptation. When we did this article on decision fatigue for the New York Times Magazine, they ran an excerpt. Both Barack Obama and Mark Zuckerberg saw that article, and they both had the same reaction to it. They both decided that they were going to try and eliminate unnecessary decisions from their lives and conserve their willpower and by having less decision fatigue. So they both decided I'm going to wear the same thing every day. Basically, I'm not going to make clothing decisions in the morning. So Mark Zuckerberg always has that T-shirt and hoodie, and Obama always had a dark suit. And he just said, and Obama also said, I'm not going to decide what to eat anymore. I'm going to just leave that to, now it's nice when you have a chef to do that decision for you, but you can, there are ways to avoid decisions. I mean, for instance, instead of having to decide every day, am I going to go for a run today? Am I going to exercise? You just schedule it to meet someone. So it's not a decision. You just have to do it. And that's conserving your willpower for other things.
All right. So those are the 8. But I do have a couple more questions. Since willpower is so tied to human physiology, what other things besides eating will improve your willpower?
Basically, anything that requires you to exercise self-control will build it over time. I mean, all these little exercises we talked about earlier about doing something with your left hand, doing something with your right hand. And I think also meditation will do that. That's been shown to, and that's why so many religions, I think, as I said, religious people have more self-control, and part of it, that meditation, focusing yourself, that you're exercising self-control to think about in a certain way, and that's building up that willpower a method. I mean, exercise is a form of, that's building up your self-control. It's also, I think, clearing out your mind from things. Getting a lot of sleep, I think, or getting enough sleep is just, and I confess, I don't really understand the mechanism for that. I don't know brain physiology that well, but it's just clear that people who don't have sleep, they've depleted their willpower, and that sleeping, helps the brain restore that source of willpower, that energy.
So one question for me as an investor, I want to invest in people that have an abundance of willpower. That seems obvious, right? How do I gauge just how much willpower a person has just by talking to them?
That's a really good question. I think to some extent, how much does somebody control themselves? Well, I mean, the first place, there are obvious things, do they actually show up on time? Do they return a call at the right time? Certainly how they spend their money. I mean, are there signs that they're kind of extravagant in ways, or do they control the way that they live their lives, their offices? But I think also just in a conversation, can they control their own emotions and their reactions? Can they actually, give you useful information in the least amount of time without indulging their need to be, their egos, their desire to kind of just talk? And do they listen to you? Do they have the control? Because people often want to just win a conversation, or they just want to indulge them. I mean, it takes self-control. And I've been talking for a long time now, and I should be exercising more self-control. But it takes self-control to give shorter answers, to be concise, to stop yourself and listen to other people. And I think that's, that's a real good measure right there.
Before we close, I'll let you exercise a little willpower. Is there anything else that you'd like to add? Anything that I've left out?
It's been a great talk, Steve. I would add simply that people can find out more about this by reading my book, Willpower. They can also visit my website, johntierneynyc.com, and read more about it, find out how to book me for a speech if they want. And I'm also working on another book with Roy Baumeister, my co-author of Willpower, that will probably be out next year. And that's going to be about why bad things affect people more strongly than good things.
Well, I'll certainly be looking for that. John, let's end here. Thank you very much for taking the time to talk. Your insights are very helpful. I enjoyed it a lot. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Steve.
This has been Intangibles, a podcast created by Antecedent Ventures. Find out more at www.antecedent.vc. I'd like to thank Denton's Venture Technology Group at dentonsventurebeyond.com for being the sponsor this season and a supportive partner. Operating as a boutique within the world's largest law firm, the Venture Technology Group runs with hard-charging tech entrepreneurs to drive growth through strategic business, finance, and legal advice, from Silicon Valley and New York to London, Berlin, Hong Kong, and beyond. Learn more at dentonsventurebeyond.com. I'd also like to thank Ben Glowy, who has been instrumental in helping me record and produce this season. I couldn't have done it without him. Find him on Twitter at visible_sound. And thank you. Keep an eye out for the next episode, and if you like this one, leave us a favorable review. I'm your host, Steve Berg.